These are your fast facts on the book of Romans. First, Paul didn't write Romans. While Paul is indeed the author of Romans, we discover in chapter 16, verse 22, that the man who actually put pen to paper was a man named Tertius. The name Tertius is Latin, meaning third. In chapter 16, he indicates that the work he was doing was more than that of a paid scribe, but as a Christian service to the church. Early church history claims that Tertius went on to become the bishop of Iconium and would later die a martyr's death. Second, the ethnic makeup of the Church of Rome is disputed. Some may assume a heavily Jewish audience for the epistle, but this is countered within the first 6 verses of the book. Others have suggested a roughly even split between Jews and Gentiles, and that certainly accounts for the direct address of the Gentiles in chapters 1 and 11, as well as the admonitions and greetings to Jewish people in chapters 14 through 16. Alternatively, it seems feasible to assume that Paul is addressing a majority Gentile congregation with a strong Jewish minority. And the reason for this dynamic can perhaps be found in Acts 18:2, where we see that Aquila and Priscilla were some of the Jewish residents of Rome who had been ejected from the city. This dynamic makes the most sense of the argument in chapter 11, where Paul is warning Gentile believers against pride and providing encouragement to Jewish believers whose faith was shaking when they saw how few of their fellow Jews were following the Jewish Messiah. Third, the purpose of the letter to the Romans is disputed. Some have suggested that Paul had concerns about the community at Rome, so the letter is thus targeted to address those divisions. Others have suggested that Paul was more concerned about his own mission and ministry, establishing a launching pad for missionary work in Spain, or defending his apostolic authority. Still, others see a more general theological aim. Paul is trying to summarize his gospel. In other words, Paul is stating what the message about the kingship of Jesus, established in his death for sins and resurrection, causes in and for the person who believes. Probably the best way to understand the purpose of the letter is to combine all 3 of these purposes. Fourth, Romans pushes the limits of what we can rightly call a letter. We have many surviving examples of letters from around the time of the book of Romans. Romans is definitely one of the longer examples of a Greco-Roman letter. Paul uses a modified letter greeting in the first 7 verses, but then proceeds to go 13 chapters without mentioning anyone else. The reason for Paul's expansion on the letter form is probably driven by the fact that he did not found the church, and because of some of the specific and unique purposes we've outlined already. Fifth, the central theme of Romans is the good news, the gospel. As Paul opens with the letter's theme in chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." Paul's gospel is powerful, able to accomplish what humans cannot, salvific, able to effect radical transformation, cross-cultural, able to impact everyone across ethnic boundaries, and revelatory, able to show us the nature of God, his righteousness. This theme of the gospel has many significant undercurrents, such as justification, as we see in chapters 3 and 5, freedom in chapters 6 and 7, assurance in chapter 8, redemptive history in chapters 9 through 11, and Christian living in chapters 12 through 15. Sixth, a critical teaching in Romans is the doctrine of justification. Justification is the legal declaration of a sinner to be righteous, as in Deuteronomy 25:1. Paul uses this term particularly in Romans 3 and 5. In Romans 5, Paul explains that this legal declaration, verse 1, results in a status or a standing before God, verse 2. Then, starting in verse 12, he portrays 2 lines of humanity, Adam and Christ, the natural and the supernatural. Every person enters into the world standing behind the line of Adam and therefore stands condemned and justly suffers death. But another Adam, Christ, suffered death wrongly and now has escaped and created a new line for humanity. When the judge looks at the line of Adam, he sees trespass and guilt and disobedience. And when the judge looks at the line of Jesus, he sees grace and righteousness and obedience. Thus, justification in Romans, as an important secondary theme, involves the legal declaration of the status or standing of those who stand behind the second Adam, viewed as righteous because of his righteousness, viewed as saints because of his holiness. This understanding of justification, to declare righteous, was highlighted by Protestants who rejected that of the Roman Catholic Church, who believed that the word means to make righteous. In other words, the Roman Catholic Church teaches that justification is a transformative process where people work alongside God in his grace to become just, whereas Protestants have pointed out that the Scriptures, and particularly Romans, teaches that justification is a forensic or legal event where God alone declares us to be just. Seventh, Romans has played an outsized role in church history. Augustine, resting under a fig tree, heard a voice saying, "Take up and read." So he picked up a copy of Romans and opened it to chapter 13, verses 13 to 14. This passage broke through Augustine's hard heart and gave him hope that his restless desires could truly find rest in Christ. It was Romans 1:17 that drove Martin Luther to see that salvation could not be found in his own merit, but only in the righteousness of Christ, and sparked the Protestant Reformation. It was Luther's commentary on Romans that drove John Wesley to trust in Christ and to preach the same good news. Countless thousands throughout history have experienced dramatic conversions through reading and hearing the book of Romans. Eighth, the book of Romans is closely connected with the city of Corinth. A few things to point out this connection. First, Phoebe, the bearer of the letter in chapter 16, verse 1, is from a town within walking distance of Corinth. 2, Erastus is mentioned in chapter 16, verse 23, and also in Acts 19, 20, and 1 Corinthians 1:14. An inscription naming an Erastus who funded the building of a road in Corinth has been excavated, potentially attesting to the historicity of the man. The implication of the Corinthian connection is that Romans was likely written by Paul while he was in Corinth for 3 months, as recorded at the beginning of Acts 20, which likely falls in AD 57. Ninth, Romans 7 may refer to Christians or to non-Christians. When Paul describes the tension between knowing to do good and practicing evil instead, some say Paul is talking about a person before they have been changed by Christ and have the Spirit dwelling within them. Others insist that the passage is talking about the ongoing struggle that believers have with the dead sin nature that still clings to us. Still, others have found the elements of both the unregenerate and the regenerate in these passages. 10th, Romans frequently uses the rhetorical device of diatribe, using questions with strong negative responses to drive home points or to correct misunderstandings. See these examples. Romans 3:3-4. What then? If some were unfaithful, will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Absolutely not. Romans 3:5-6. But if our unrighteousness highlights God's righteousness, what are we to say? I am using a human argument. Is God unrighteous to inflict wrath? Absolutely not. Romans 3:9. What then? Are we better off? Not at all. Romans 6:1-2. What should we say then? Should we continue in sin that grace may multiply? Absolutely not. Romans 6:15. What then? Should we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? Absolutely not. Romans 7:7. What should we say then? Is the law sin? Absolutely not. Romans 7:13. Therefore, did what is good become death to me? Absolutely not. Paul's use of these rhetorical elements should remind us that the book of Romans is carefully designed and written in order to drive home important theological and practical claims. As we read Romans, we would do well to consider the carefully tailored arguments that Paul is making. 11th, Romans provides important teaching regarding non-essential practices. Some people approach all matters as equally essential to the Christian faith. Everything is rigid and unchanging. Others see nothing at all as essential to the Christian faith. Everything is fluid and ever-changing. The book of Romans demonstrates that there are clearly things that are of utmost importance, such as the gospel that Paul proclaims to Jewish and Gentile people. But in chapter 14, Paul also shows that Christians can exercise a degree of liberty in certain matters of daily conduct and should not be compelled otherwise. 12th, and lastly, the first interpreter of the book of Romans was a woman. Paul entrusted this valuable and inspired book to a servant named Phoebe, as we see in chapter 16, verse 1. Sometimes that word servant is also translated deacon. If Paul used standard practices in the ancient world for letters, it seems likely that Phoebe would have been coached by Paul in how to read the letter to the church, and perhaps would have been equipped to answer questions about the letter posed to her by the church at Rome. And those are your fast facts on the book of Romans.